Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features investor and rare disease entrepreneur Imran Babar.
My name is Jennifer Hawks Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We are very happy that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. A special thanks to our partners at Vertex for sponsoring this month's series of breakfast discussions. Today, we have a very special guest in Imran Babar, and we are going to talk about, really, we're going to cover the waterfront. We're going to talk about company formation, we're going to talk about investing, and we're going to talk about rare disease, particularly as we start our lead up to our second patient engagement summit on April 6th. We really want to start delving into some how we finance, fund, and create therapeutics for the patient journey. So this is a really important discussion topic. And I think it's sprinkled in really in a lot of things that we cover. It's rare, I think, that on one of our breakfasts, no matter who the guest is, that we don't talk about the patient journey and how we take that into account more now than we have before. As a matter of housekeeping, I always remind you, please put your questions in the chat or the Q&A, and Derek and I will get to those as we go through our discussion. With that, I will turn it over to Derek to kick off our conversation. We look forward to it. Thanks.
All right, Imran, good morning. It's great to have you here. I really can't think of a better person with all of the perspectives around rare diseases than you as part of Rare Disease Month. And as a funny bit of history, I actually remember, sitting in a coffee shop with you on 57th Street or whatever it was, about the week before you went to go and help kick off SIDAN. So it's great to have you here. As for a little bit of an intro for our audience, why don't you give us a little bit of your background, kind of your connection to rare diseases and how you got to where you are today?
Absolutely. And first of all, thanks for the invitation. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here. And thanks for everyone getting up early, and hopefully you have coffees in hand as we kick off this breakfast seminar. So, I'll give a little bit of a background. I'll go in reverse chronological order in terms of where I've been and where I am now. So over the last 3.5 years or so, I've been the Chief Business Officer at SIDAN. SIDAN is an orphan drug accelerator that focuses on company creation, specifically within the rare disease space. And I'll give some more details on that later. I'm going to kind of reserve that for when we talk more specifically about the SIDAN model. But I'll just say it's been a lot of fun. I've had a lot of fun over the last several years. Certainly, it's had some challenges, but it's been a very unique experience to be a part of SIDAN. Prior to SIDAN, I was actually in venture capital. So I was working at OrbiMed Advisors, which is, I think, still the world's largest healthcare dedicated investment firm. They've got a few verticals for investing in healthcare. They've got the public equity sort of long-short strategy. They've also got the royalty and debt investing strategy. And then they have the private equity strategy, which is where I work. So I worked on the venture capital team. Most of my time was focused on the sort of US-based fund that invests globally. But I also spent some time with the Israeli group as well, which was a lot of fun. I think it is one of the broadest platforms for investing in healthcare, so a lot of exposure to life sciences and biotech. Again, I'll get more details on that later. Prior to OrbiMed, I was at Cowen, where I was an associate in equity research. And this is where I worked with Eric Schmidt and Phil Nadeau. I think they were phenomenal mentors. And this is my first job out of grad school. And I'd say that was like drinking, water out of a fire hydrant. That, had to learn a lot.
Can't get a better start than that.
Yeah,
those guys do about some of the best research on the street. And even when you think about it, the level of you used to go, you get the books, right? You get the books at the conference, and people that put together the people that put together those books are the people that they grab out of their PhD. So.
Yes, those books were monsters to put together, but I learned a lot. I'll just say that, and they're basically like this thick. We had the therapeutic categories book, and then with the biotechnology quarterlies, which again, some late nights and early mornings working on those. But again,
trees are not a fan of Cowen and Company.
Yeah, but it was a phenomenal experience, I have to say. I think I learned a lot, and I think really, I think Eric and Phil were just great mentors. It's kind of fun. I think at the time, honestly, coming out of grad school, I didn't know a lot about the street, about Wall Street. And I think I really lucked out. I was blessed to be able to join those guys because they were in particular good mentors, and it was a really good platform to do equity research. And to be honest, I would not have known that at the time, but I think it was one of the best places I could have gone. And I think the other thing I'll say, and again, I have to give more details on this later, but it was interesting coming out of my graduate work where I was working on microRNAs, really exciting area. I did my PhD in the microRNA field with Frank Slack, and I loved it. But I was really studying one or two microRNAs in a couple of oncology related processes, right? So it was very focused. But then when I joined Cowen, it was this whole new world of the industry that opened up to me. And I think particularly the time that I joined, so this was when there was a renaissance going on in several areas. And I had to learn about all these areas. So there was prostate cancer, right? We had Dendrian, you had Medivation, you had all these companies working in prostate cancer. Even rare diseases, I think was around the time that Ultragenyx was formed. I wrote the initiation report for Synagiva. There was just a lot going on as the rare disease space was ramping up. This was, MS, the multiple sclerosis was going through sort of a complete transformation. This was Biogen was developing BG12, which eventually became Tecfidera, and Tysabri, and so just a lot going on there. Then Hep C, so I was covering Gilead and Achillion and Vertex, and there was just so many different areas that were just undergoing, I think, and many would say a renaissance, and kind of covering those areas. I think for me, I became addicted to it, and that's where I sort of decided that this is kind of the industry for me. The other thing I'll mention, in terms of my PhD, again, I think I worked mostly on microRNAs. I was able to form collaborations with folks in other departments, so biomedical engineering, so Mark Saltzman at Yale, and then also with therapeutic radiology, so Joanne Wiedas and Peter Glazer, all of whom actually are entrepreneurs working, in company creation along with the research that they're doing. It's always kind of a highlight of my experience to being able to collaborate outside of my department and sort of applying my research to other areas and learning from others, and then also being able to publish with them. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'll stop and ask Derek and Jennifer to kind of guide the conversation, is just I'm also the co-founder of a nonprofit called Virginomics Institute, and this I'd have to say has been one of the experiences of a lifetime being involved with Virginomics. It's a nonprofit that's focused on helping rare disease patients, and I'd say there are a few distinctives for the organization. I think one is that we've always really had what we can call sort of a science-first approach. Really wanted to use the tools of science to try to help better the situation for rare disease patients. And we initially got started on diagnostics, and we just really started off the observation that there are a lot of rare disease patients who are undiagnosed. They don't really know what they have, and you hear this term, diagnostic odyssey. For many,
right, or the journey, right?
Yes, exactly. This journey where they can spend 5, 6, sometimes 7 years trying to figure out what they have, and it's a really frustrating process. And I'm grateful now that more and more sort of the genome sequencing technology is applied in a lot of these situations where it makes sense. But at the time we were studying the nonprofit, it wasn't being applied as much. And so we said, well, why don't we provide a platform for these undiagnosed patients to get their genome sequence, or initially starting with their exomes, getting their exome sequence, a trio, mother, father, and child. Most of the time, or often, it's really a child that's impacted, and that will at least start the process. If there's a variant that's of functional significance that can help explain their condition, that will be significant. We actually start the process. So that's what we did. So we established a crowdfunding platform to be able to sequence these individuals. And I think that, again, just kind of learning more and more about the needs in the space, we kind of expanded to do promote research for rare diseases. We established patient communities, so patient advocacy as part of our platform. But it's really always focused on using the tools of science to try to help better the situation for these patients. And of what matters for us, look, we're not raising tens of millions or billions of dollars or anything along those lines. But what if we could help one patient, here and there, again, we've helped hundreds of patients. But for us, kind of what matters, and that's something that we've been focused. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of the distinctive, it's a volunteer-based organization. So this is where I finish up at Cowen or OrbiMed or Sidon. I've kind of been able to do this the entire time I've been working at these great places, nights and weekends. So we're volunteer-based. which really allows the majority of our resources to be used on our program. So we did have an executive director, just one person that we had hired a while ago, but I think by and large, the majority of the finances that we've raised have gone to the programs. And so that I think has been a real, like I said, experience of a lifetime being involved with rare genomics. In many ways, it's kind of shaped my career path and sort of my transition to science. So let me stop there. That's a mouthful, but
no, we were going to get there later, but let's stay here now. So where were you when you found it? How did it come together? Where were you when you founded it? How did you know the other people that got involved? Because this is, this has been a big topic for a while now, and I think once people realize that, it's not, snap your fingers, get your genome sequenced, and here we know what's happening. In a lot of ways, it's one piece of the journey, and maybe it works and maybe it doesn't, but in a lot of ways, this represents kind of one more piece of information for not only for the patient, but for the parents and for everyone else around them. It's really a huge thing, especially where in many ways it's a diagnostic journey, because most people go from, an I don't know to an I don't know to an I don't know. They go from, it's like a serial progression of no answers, right? Which is incredibly frustrating. It's incredibly difficult on so many levels. So where did this come from? Where were you when you started it? How did you know the other people involved?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of how you framed it. And I think for me, I honestly was not that aware of rare diseases, as a grad student. I think I had some family friends who had sort of these, conditions that they didn't really couldn't quite put their finger on. So I had some exposure through family friends who were impacted. And you hear people say that, even though it's called rare diseases, it turns out that a lot of people are impacted by rare diseases. There are so many rare diseases, right? And it turns out that a lot of people are impacted. And so probably all of us on this, in this conversation know people that are impacted. So I had some general awareness, but I wasn't really deep in the space. Came about through some conversations with some friends that I had made through a particular network called the Harvey Fellowship Network. It's just, they provide a scholarship for graduate students. And, in these conversations with one or two individuals, I really want to credit my co-founder, Jimmy Lin. He really was starting to dive deep into the space. And he was working at Johns Hopkins, applying exome sequencing in the context of cancer. And really that was what his work was focused on. And it really, I think that the thought was, well, why don't we just apply this for rare disease patients? And, because as we became more and more aware of some of the needs in the rare disease community. So that's really how it came about. Conversation among folks that had sort of been co-recipients of a particular fellowship. And it really initially started with just a few individuals, and, from there we began to expand the team. And it was, I think for me, as I was wrapping up my graduate work, it was just really fun to be involved in an entrepreneurial sort of endeavor where I really genuinely was convinced of the need. And again, as I became more and more aware of these stories, we worked with syndromes without a name for a while. We began to have some conversations with NORD and began again expanding that, obviously to a number of other groups and, global genes, et cetera, and becoming more aware of it. So, there really is a need here. And, one of the key needs at the time was sort of diagnostics. And so from there, we were all, again, we were kind of in the sciences. I was doing my PhD, Jimmy was doing his MD, PhD, and then as we began to expand the team, more and more others, and we just happened to know we're in the sciences. And so we just began to leverage our connections in academia initially, and then eventually with industry. Right now, I'll shout out to Illumina. We have a great collaboration with them where they're actually providing some pro bono sequencing still today. But we initially worked with academic institutions to provide just sort of fee for service, basically at cost, sequencing services to help us, be able to sequence these patients. We had a process. Again, we were very clear that, we're not sort of trying to give a clinical diagnosis. Was really focused on research, because we thought it's really important to involve the medical community in an individual patient's situation. And so we had genetic counselors that they would see, and then if they, sort of met certain criteria, then we would, put them through our pipeline, and they would get their exome sequence. And then it's not enough, obviously. I think we all know it's not enough just get a sequence, but then what about the interpretation? What about the analysis?
Right.
And so then we want to use the most cutting edge technologies to be able to analyze, and people that have the knowledge about how to do it, analyze the information that comes out of it. And sometimes these can get missed, actually. So we actually have this whole mission to focus on reanalysis. because sometimes things will get missed. And so,
Right.
so basically that was another part of it, is really getting the people around the table that could actually do the analysis and help flesh out if there are variants of functional significance for these patients. And so,
Yeah.
so anyway, that's how it got started. Again, it began to expand, massively. And I think, starting from like 3 or 4 people, having conversations, with this kind of, vision, to establishing a 501c3 and getting, 150 to 200 volunteers, international representation, collaborations, and again, volunteer-based organization. I don't want to overstate what we did, but we were able to, I think, make an impact on a number of hundreds of individuals that were really struggling. And so then we established patient advocacy. We established some initiatives to raise money with this initiative called Be Heard, which we've been able to raise millions of dollars actually to be able to support research in rare diseases, awarding technologies and resources to researchers around the world that are focused on rare diseases. And so this has been a really fun to kind of see that grow over the course of a number of years now. And as I said, kind of it's helped shape my perspective as I've worked in healthcare finance and then in operations at SciDen.
So let me ask you this, is because, a lot of our audience is the New York market, right? We have a lot of earlier stage companies here, right? So we have a lot of entrepreneurs who are probably listening. You just looking at the Rare Genomics website, you see your list of partners, and it literally covers international, but like academic institutions across the entire country, companies that have partnered. How was your process of growing that list of partners in order to serve the patients, right? Because I think a lot of our entrepreneurs are thinking ahead, like, okay, we need to partner. Where do we look for partners? How did you do that process as a nonprofit, right? It's different than you're developing a product and you need to partner to get it to market.
Yeah, no, great question. I think it came from, I guess, a couple of, and probably the only 2 ways you can think of, but it was a matter of both. One, sort of inbound interest as more and more folks kind of learned what we're doing, had some attention from the media, various news outlets kind of got wind of what we're doing and would sort of publish some of the work that we were doing. So folks would reach out to us, and it was really exciting when that happened. Jimmy gave a couple of TED Talks on what we were doing, and we were able to go to different conferences. So we did have some inbound. But to your point, I think we also did a lot of outreach. And I think especially in the early days, it was a matter of saying, well, what are the needs and who are the potential partners that can help fill those needs as we're trying to help rare disease patients. And initially it was the academic institutions. I was at Yale. And so, who's actually leading the core facilities that are doing the sequencing and reaching out. So again, I remember establishing some relationships there, and then we reached out to other academic institutions. So initially it was sort of the academic institutions, and then began reaching out to companies as well. And then again, there were companies. I think people really, got excited about what we were doing. And I think we really had, I think, a lot of success, especially in the early days, as people said, yeah, that's a really cool idea. We get it. And we're going to give it to you at cost. We still had to raise the money for the trios to do it at cost. But people generally, kind of caught the vision and were wanting to help us out. So, again, initially was focused on the institutions that could do the sequencing and then the analysis. And again, it came down to people getting volunteers that had the expertise. So we definitely did some outreach, but we also had some inbound interest, again, as people got wind of what we were doing. And then internationally, we have a great collaboration. I think one of our first collaborations with Noam Shamran in Israel, University of Tel Aviv, and then a number of others. We had a great collaboration with folks in Australia and Korea, et cetera. And again, they began to expand from there. So again, it was a mix of inbound as well as outbound based on, the needs that we had.
Yeah, you said something before that I think is important that we should just talk about for a second, which is, you're okay with n equals 1, right? There's the importance of each individual patient and each family, et cetera, and you get into almost the realm of, okay, just one more, right? And just one more, and just one more, and each one, it's incredibly valuable to the people that you're helping. And I think, at least from a partnership perspective, there's a little bit of an advantage to asking to be able to sequence, a few samples here and there or something like that. Something tells me if you were really interested in helping cardiology patients and you said, okay, I have these 50,000 people that we're going to sequence, perhaps Illumina may or may not have ponied up on the pro bono on that one.
Yeah, fair enough. Absolutely, absolutely. And I think, you're right. I think, there's, I think each of these partners, I mean, they again, they've been phenomenal. And I think you're right. If we end up having, hundreds of thousands or, tens of thousands where we'd have to probably consider a little bit of a different model.
Yeah.
But again, I think, overall our experience has been they really wanted to step in and help and again, kind of catching the vision of what we're doing. And again, we're not necessarily, using massive amounts of resources, but I think for the folks that we're able to help, it matters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So why don't we shift gears a little bit and start to think about the investing side of the ball, right? So you go from Cowen to OrbiMed, and you go literally from Wall Street now to private company investment, whether it's formation, whether it's anything else. So how was your adjustment to venture? What were some of the things you thought about it initially? And what were some of the things that kind of really took root that kind of helped you to grow there?
Yeah. So I think maybe first I'll comment on sort of the transition, right, from Cowen to OrbiMed. And I think for me, there were kind of came the two different axes in which I was considering the transition. One was sell side versus buy side. So obviously Cowen, I was on the sell side. And I think for me, that was kind of an easier question. I think when you do deep analysis on a variety of biotechs, and then you're advising clients, I mean, there's some level of fulfillment in being able to do that. But at the end of the day, I want to be able to put my research and my analysis to work, right? So for me, the buy side had appeal in that regard. The second axis, I would say, was private versus public, right? So obviously, on your Wall Street, focusing mostly on public companies. Obviously, we had exposure to private companies that were contemplating IPOs and public markets, etc. But as I learned more about the private side of things, I think I became interested in venture just because, one, I was comfortable with earlier stage companies. I had some exposure to this at Yale when I was working in the laboratory. My advisor started a company, and so I had some exposure to that, so the entrepreneurial side of things. Early stage companies still figuring things out. I was comfortable with earlier data sets, preclinical models. Like I was comfortable with that. I didn't necessarily need to have clinical data. Although it's kind of funny to even say that now, because I think how many preclinical stage companies are public now.
Public, yeah.
I think
I was just thinking that. I was going to say, but usually those companies are later in their life cycle. I said, well, not anymore.
Not now.
Not anymore. Nope, doesn't hold anymore.
Exactly. So I think at the time, maybe a little over a decade ago, probably fewer preclinical stage companies that were public. More of those probably in the private world. But again, I was comfortable with that. Probably the most important factor for me was just the idea of being able to roll up my sleeves and being able to partner with the company longer term. So I was less interested in sort of positioning sort of around a particular catalyst for a relatively short period of time, sort of like, getting up every morning. And so, where's the stock price, what's going on, and sort of that kind of, and in some ways there's a bit of adrenaline you get from that, which it can be exciting to do that. And, but I was really interested in, like longer term partnering with the company, being on the board, helping to create value. Was something that was really interesting to me. So that's what really it was sort of appealing to me about venture. When I joined OrbiMed, I would say that I was, in many ways, I'd say bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. Like I was excited about it. I think, although I didn't know much about Cowen and sort of the profile, I mean, I had some sense for it, but I didn't really appreciate, how good I had it at Cowen. By the time I had been at Cowen for the time, for a couple of years, I did understand that OrbiMed was a great place to be. And I think that, if you're going to do buy side investing, that was a phenomenal place to be. So I think I came there really excited. And I did find it to be a phenomenal place. I think that, initially a lot of my time was focused on doing due diligence. I would say the venture business, there's kind of three buckets of activities. And in many ways, they're all kind of related in some way. But one would be sourcing deals. You've got to be able to find interesting deals, getting access to quality deals. Two would be doing due diligence. So this is, evaluating companies, assessing companies on a variety of sort of measures. And then third would be managing deals, post-investment. So this is where you're sitting on the board and managing your portfolio, and sort of helping them get to the next stage. Most of my time initially was spent on that middle bucket, doing due diligence, which I actually loved. I loved analyzing companies. At the end of the day, as an investor, you've really got to figure out as quickly as possible, boil it down to what are the, 2 or 3 key questions for a particular investment. Usually there's going to be, a couple of key questions that you've really got to diligence. If there are like, 5 or 6 or 7 questions that are like key questions, which you don't have good answers to, that's probably too many layers of risk for you, right? And so at
Right.
that point, it becomes more of an easy, it's probably not a company that I spend a lot of time on. So anyways, that was exciting to me, just kind of figuring out, well, what are the 2 or 3 key questions, doing the due diligence on those questions, and driving to sort of a conclusion on, okay, is this a good investment or not? What I began to understand as a year, 2 years, 3 years into the job, was that a lot of the success actually comes, number one, in expanding and deepening your networks to be able to get access to quality deals, right? And that becomes increasingly important, especially as you sort of approach and work to become a partner or a general partner. That becomes, I think, extremely important as a venture capitalist. And then second is sort of, being able to be on the third bucket that I mentioned, managing your portfolio companies, the ability to sort of build a good reputation, being an investor that other investors want to work with, and you get exposure to that at the board level, and then also that companies want to work with. The high quality management teams, you're going to get a sense for, like, what is your track record? What kind of investor are you? What kind of board member are you? So again, helping to create value at the board level becomes increasingly important. And so I think, again, I began to get more and more exposure to those other aspects of the business over time. So I think that, for me, it was, again, there's a lot of things that I could say. I think, OrbiMed, because of how broad the platform was, I got exposure to a lot of things. So most of my time was spent in therapeutics, but I even worked, I worked in diagnostics. I worked in even healthcare IT. We had a venture partner there that was focused on that. So I really got pretty broad exposure to a lot of things. Some highlights I would say in terms of OrbiMed, I did deep dives into gene therapy. So one of the first investments I made was with Rishi on the West Coast. We actually spent some time, did a site visit with Jim Wilson. And our first, my first investment at OrbiMed was Dimension Therapeutics, which is a really interesting story. Eventually that company was acquired. Definitely had to navigate some things, but I think overall it was, I think it was a good investment for us. And, Audenti, so I worked with Matt Patterson and the team there. It was another really exciting story, going after myotubular myopathy, excellent myotubular myopathy. Again, really exciting story to be a part of, kind of helped them out with some BD strategy in the early days. Did deep dives into microbiome space. This is the time where, it
was hot then, right?
Yes, there were a lot, there were, over a dozen microbiome companies that were getting off the ground. And, I think the biology turns out to be, pretty complicated in many ways, but I think
it's really hard. That's an understatement.
Yes, but again, nonetheless, interesting space. And spent some time on, sort of late stage oncology, autoimmune diseases. But one really interesting investment for me was actually being involved with True North Therapeutics. And this is one that I really was excited to be involved with that. So I worked with Carl on that. And it was a preclinical stage company at the time we looked at it. And, really, so they were targeting an aspect of the complement pathway. And what was exciting to me is that I think we had getting a mature enough understanding of the biology for a particular area in immunology that we could actually target specific components for specific diseases, right? So, targeting the classical cascade versus the alternative path, right? So we had enough of an understanding of the classical pathway and sort of the indications that were relevant and the particular areas within the complement cascade that we wanted to target for a particular indication. And so just understanding, dissecting that biology, taking advantage of some of these ex vivo assays to give us confidence on the technology and on the approach. And I mentioned that one just because I think recently, within the last couple of weeks, Sanofi, which acquired the program through their acquisition of Ayurveda, recently announced that drug was actually just approved. And so kind of seeing that all the way from sort of OrbiMed's investment when it was a preclinical stage company all the way to now in its approved therapy, I think to me was just really exciting to kind of see that.
Well, that one was, I was going to say that one's kind of like next generation Alexion, right? You're thinking, complement pathway, where does it go from here? And it's funny, you think all the way back to then, you think of where we are now. It just, so many of these things hammer home the fact that our industry has a long time cycle. And, ultimately, if the science is good enough and if the science is right, if you get the biology, ultimately you can get there. It takes a lot of bumps in the road to get there, but ultimately you can get there.
Yes, right. Absolutely. Yes. I think that's exactly right. Biotech is a roller coaster ride, and I think that you've got to be prepared for the highs, but also the lows. And so again, there's so many components that go into that in terms of the team that you're working with and so the culture that they're building, the board, the investors, are they sort of in it for the long term? Are they looking to sort of get a quick hit? So there's a lot of considerations, I think, that come into what you just said in terms of just understanding that it is going to be a long ride. It's a long journey when you're a part of a biotech developing a drug. So yeah, one of the things that I appreciate about OrbiMed is that OrbiMed was has willing to just invest in whatever makes sense. It wasn't so like we're only going to do early stage investing, or we're only going to do late stage investing, or we're only going to do oncology, or we're only going to do XYZ. They were just, I think that if there's an exciting technology that made sense, whether it was early, whether it was late, I think OrbiMed was willing to do it. And I think that, it didn't have any sort of thresholds in terms of ownership requirements necessarily. I mean, obviously you got to think through that in terms of, you can't, if you're a large fund, you can't make a ton of super small bets, but I think it just it is a very versatile investment strategy, which I think I really benefited from kind of seeing that. So that, again, allows you to kind of adjust according to the market, right? If the markets are really hot and valuations are really high, sometimes you think about, okay, well, maybe you can take advantage of some of these crossover types of rounds, these companies that are going to soon go public. But then also you think about, okay, well, earlier stage where you're going to get the better valuation. So maybe you think about creating your own companies, right? Where valuations like in our current market are getting more depressed. Maybe you can sort of think about some of these companies that have more advanced technologies, but you can get them at sort of discounts, right? So it just allowed the group to kind of really be, allowed us, when I was a part of the team, to kind of, be versatile in our strategy. So that's something that I really appreciated. The other thing I'd say is that, just really deep expertise, deep networks, folks that had just, great investing experience, but then also operational experience with the venture partners, operating partners, entrepreneurs and residents. So just really deep expertise in sort of a broad range of areas, which I think is really important. You can't be superficial. You can't do venture capital as sort of a side gig, right? And honestly, I think I've seen that sometimes where, maybe sort of a more public sort of vehicles would just say, oh, well, it's a good idea to kind of do venture capital so we can get into deals earlier. But, it's really important to put the resources behind it, because venture capital, do it successfully over the long term, you've really got to have deep roots in the industry and have deep networks in order to be successful. And so I think that's something that was really important. So anyways, I'm going on. I can say a lot, but let me stop there because you probably have
no, that's good. And so like you talked about OrbiMed being sort of all agnostic, right? Right, like somewhat timing agnostic, therapeutic area agnostic. What about today? Like if you look at today, because there's been so much ink lately on, sort of the public market plight of biotech over the last 12 months, right? And it hasn't been great, but there still seems to be a ton of capital ready to be deployed in the private market. So where do you see venture investing today, and sort of what is that environment? How is it different from when you were doing investments at OrbiMed?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I want to be clear, obviously, saying, so in terms of OrbiMed strategy, like, there are a lot of incredible folks there. You should ask them about the strategy, etc. So obviously I don't any longer represent OrbiMed, but in terms of like the broader market, I think there's a lot of different strategies, right, in terms of what I've seen in the venture landscape, and I think there are the investors. Something I think about a lot, especially, and again we'll talk more about Cydan. Cydan is a very asset centric model, right, where it's really focused on, we want to develop products and we want to do it in a very capital efficient manner, right? And I think that so you see a lot of investors that have really been very focused on platform companies, early stage, kind of really trying to flesh out sort of high science, big ideas, and really say, okay, well, can we do something with this really cool big idea, and can we eventually get it to a point where we can think about drug development, right? Sort of this early stage, kind of boiling it down. And I think that other investors are going to be a bit more focused on products. What are the actual products that are going to come out of the platforms? I think from my background, I've always really been sort of focused on products, and I think that's why in many ways Cydan appealed to me, is in terms of asset centric. I say, well, a platform is only as valuable as the products that come out of it. That's kind of been my perspective. And so I think that, you've got to find that balance, right? If you have a really interesting platform, you do have to be able to invest in the platform, flesh it out. And again, maybe again, as a business development executive, thinking about, well, what are some ways we can leverage partners and leverage other resources to be able to help flesh out and build the platform. But at the end of the day, I think especially investors, they can be more and more focused on, okay, well, what is a lead program? What are the programs that are coming out of this platform? And it's interesting as well. I think to a large degree, investors will give 70, 80% of your value to whatever that lead program is. You could have this whole pipeline behind you.
Right.
And it could be other really interesting programs. You could have a platform, but a lot of times investors, well, what is that lead program?
Lead
asset.
Really
contribute 70, 80% of the value, right? So I think that's kind of interesting. And so again, companies, need to be aware of that just in terms of, where they put in their resources, how are they framing the story, et cetera, because that's typically what I've observed. How the market is going to change. I think it's still the early days, right? In terms of, biotech has taken a real shift. It's had a really tough year, especially the mid cap, small cap biotech over last, over 2021. And I think I saw a Cowen report that talked about the month of January, which is a real challenging month, real challenging year, right?
Yeah.
So we're I think where are we going from here? It's hard to say. I think there are a lot of factors that need to be considered. I think the landscape has seen, there've been a lot. So biotech had a heyday, right? Over the last, again, I'm not getting the exact years, but over the last decade, let's call it, it's been a really interesting time, especially in 2014, 15, 16, 17. And there've been some better years and some worse years in that time frame. But, it's been a real run. And as a result of that, there've been a lot of funds that have been raised, right? So you have the tried and true firms that have been around, the OrbiMeds of the world, that have been able to raise, more and more funds, massive funds. But then you have a lot of new funds cropping up, raising maybe smaller dollars. But I think what you've seen is almost a flood of capital into these, venture funds in our industry over the last, 5, 6 years or so. So, but then now you see sort of this sense in which, well, because of this depression that's recently happened, where there's sort of a sense in which, okay, well, what are the companies that actually have been able to sort of withstand sort of this challenging time in the market, right? And so and how have been some of these other funds that have had maybe they've had a strategy of sort of kind of going into these companies that are crossover now public, and now these values are deeper. So there's a lot of things going on in the market. For some investors, I think it's actually a good time because you can potentially find discounts. You can find true value, high quality companies that are trading at a lower valuation. I think if you've got deep pockets, you're a long-term investor, you've been around, you're going to weather the storm. You're going to be fine, but you just have to, it becomes increasingly important to invest based upon fundamentals rather than FOMO, right? Fundamentals rather than sentiment, or rather than, this is going to go public really quickly and I can do a quick flip. And so this is where I think the investors that have been disciplined, this is where I think that strategy is going to, make a big difference for them, right? And so, again, different investors have different strategies. I think, again, you have some of the, I think the disciplined investors that are investing based upon fundamentals where there's real value, that are kind of thinking about, how do we add value to companies over the course of time? I think that they're going to be able to, be fine, through this time. They're actually going to be great because they're going to find discounted value, right? Whereas others that have maybe not been as disciplined, may find themselves in a tougher situation, right? And so where the hope has been sort of on the public markets, kind of saving the day and kind of more of a FOMO investing strategy, that's going to be a little bit tougher. The other consideration is thinking about balance sheets, right? So if you're sort of you don't have the deep pockets to invest in the longer term and really support a company, you might be thinking, okay, well, I think this company is discounted. I think it's a great company, high quality company. But now you got to think about, okay, well, is this company going to be able to get through this financing, right? And so I think more and more investors, as well as executives that are thinking about their next gig, are thinking, well, what is the financing situation? What is the balance sheet? And are they going to be able to get to the next inflection point? Are they going to be able to raise more capital, right? I think if you're a deep pocketed investor, maybe that's less of a concern because you're able to support them to that time if you need to, at least at a certain level, right? You're able to gather and get your syndicate and get folks around the table. But if you don't have the deep pockets, maybe that's more of a consideration, just because you might be able to invest in that company, but your investment may not be enough to get them through that financing overhang. And so you've got to think about that as well. what are the balance sheets, ability to raise capital in sort of a bear market. And then even, it was kind of interesting as well. I think that, some companies are, I think it's going to be, in terms of the financings, I actually just saw, like, there was a financing announced today, $200 million financing that was announced today. So I think that there are going to be, I think, fewer and fewer companies that are going to be able to raise these large financings, right? I think that investors are going to be a bit more discerning in some ways. I think we're still going to see these large finances. We're still going to see these companies and management teams that are able to raise these large financings, but I don't think it's going to be quite as easy in some ways, or quite as regular as we would have seen, obviously, maybe a couple or a few years ago. So
well, it almost gotten harder to raise a small round, right? Than a large round in some, in many circumstances.
Yeah.
It's going to be really interesting to there was a good thread the other day. It's going to be really interesting to see the companies that now have these $100 million, $200 million rounds for a platform, to actually see what they put into the clinic and how they actually advance those assets into the clinic. Now you've got, especially with a lot of these platform companies, now you've got a bit of a balancing game, right? How far can you actually take the assets you're going to generate? And it really goes back to something that you said before. It's now, there's going to be a big focus on what are the assets that are coming out of your platform, right? You're only, at this point, not to be a little glib, but waving your hands and saying AI is only going to get you so far. At some point now that you've, if you're 3 years out from your $250 million A round, you should probably have something in the clinic, and sooner or later you're going to be judged by biology and not necessarily your discovery engine. So it's going to be very interesting to see what companies put into the clinic. So to kind of transition a little bit there, so when you were at Cidan, you had a very asset-centric model, right? So what are the ways that you thought of, how did you look at an investment, if we kind of take ourselves back to almost a single asset model? How do you think about a particular asset, financing a single asset, putting either that team or that vehicle together? And how do you think about that a little bit differently from the promise, right? How much of it is really nuts and bolts and knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know in that situation?
Right. So in terms of how we put together a company, and how we think about that, I think, so I think there's kind of three main components that go into building a company as we've kind of looked at it. I think one is the people. You've got to have a management team, and I think you mentioned this in one of your notes to me, Derek. I think you said it well. Sort of a centralized pool of talent that focuses on rare diseases, and now that's absolutely critical. So having the people involved that are able to do it. Two is the capital, and this is where I think one of the distinctives of the Cidan model is that we have a set of investors. Cidan had a set of investors, 5 investors with deep pockets and ability to support the companies that we started. So that was really important. So for example, you could have a pool of people, with talent, but if you don't have necessarily capital behind them, it becomes a little bit of a different model. It becomes a bit more challenging, right? And so the fact that the investors were kind of walking hand in hand, they were incentivized to support the work that Cidan management team was doing, was really important. And the third thing is the technology, right? And that's probably to state the obvious. You got to have the technology, and there's sort of many different things I could say about each of those components, right? In terms of the people and the investors and the technology. One of the things I'll say about the technology, maybe I'll just start with the technology, is that we had a focus. We had basically sort of different, I guess again, sort of axes or buckets in which we evaluated technologies, and I think that we obviously would really focus on the science. Like again, what sort of science first? Does it make sense technically? The underlying biology. Are we targeting the right mechanism of action? For a particular indication. So thinking about that, thinking about the modality, right, and then maybe even stepping back, and this is I think is relevant for investors as well. Thinking about the layers of risk, right? On a foundational level, we've got to understand the biology, and what is the risk with respect to the biology? How fleshed out is it? Do we understand in terms of what are the what's actually causing this particular biology? What's actually causing this sort of indication, right? Then you can think about, well, what about the modality that you're using, right? Sort of the tried and true modalities. In some ways, you say, well, maybe whether it's small molecules or antibody therapeutics, et cetera, or maybe some of these more novel modalities. So what we'd focus on is we really want to make sure that we understood the mechanism of action, that we understood the biology. We'd focus on certain modalities. So we focused on small molecules, we focused on protein therapeutics and oligos. We did less in gene therapy and cell therapy, and we really, in many ways, we didn't really do much in those modalities. In large part, it was because of how the model was framed. We really tried to be very capital efficient, and because of the capital requirements for gene therapy and cell therapy with respect to manufacturing, we typically didn't focus on those modalities, right?
Yeah.
And then you can think about the indication, right? So, what does it take to actually develop a drug in a particular area? How tried and true is the regulatory path, right? What are the endpoints? Are they, has the FDA spoken in a particular area? Oftentimes in the rare disease space, there's sort of, counter forces at work. Well, on the one hand, you expect some regulatory flexibility because this is a novel indication. There's no drugs approved for it. And so maybe you might expect sort of a biomarker, kind of approach might be more acceptable. On the other hand, this is a novel area, and the FDA has not necessarily weighed in on a particular area. And there have been examples where there's almost been a sense of like changing the goalposts with respect to the regulatory path for a particular area. So there's kind of the risk of not knowing exactly what that regulatory path are going to be. In some ways, having to invent the wheel, so to speak, in a particular area, understanding what are the measures that are relevant for a particular indication. And there's like, in some ways, maybe a segue in terms of the patient perspective, what are the relevant, but what matters to the patient, putting together those sort of scales and those measures to actually assess that. Thinking about the time frame for development, right? Is this the biology could be clear, the modality could be, well appreciated, but then, if what is the time frame to actually, see a difference in terms of a benefit for patients? Is it a 6-month trial? Is it a 2-year trial? Or is it a 3-year trial, right? So what is that time frame, and then the capital requirements associated with that? So anyway, so we would really think very carefully about that. Obviously, then there's the business case as well. What is the commercial case? And this is an entire, area in its own right? What is the threshold in terms of number of patients that we're willing to go after, right? And I think, Sidon, we would typically say like 1,000 patients in the US, 1,000 identifiable patients in the US. There was some flexibility on that. I actually kind of, pushed for lowering that threshold to some degree. And I think there were some indications which we evaluated, where, again, depending on sort of what are the other layers of risk, if the mechanism of action is clear, if there's good patient advocacy, if we can actually help develop patient advocacy and thinking about the natural history of these indications, et cetera, maybe we could lower that threshold in terms of epidemiology, right? But what is that threshold? Different companies will have different thresholds, right? Some of the larger rare disease companies, they'll say they'll use the term medium rare, right? And what they mean by medium rare typically is, well, they need to be like, 20, 30, 40,000 patients, for us to really get interested, right? Versus ultra rare, right? And so different companies will have kind of different thresholds on what that looks like. But that's something we thought a lot about. And what is the actual epidemiology, right? You can read a review article and say, oh, well, this is, 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000, whatever that number is. But then you go and you dig down and you say, well, where did this number actually come from? And you find that it's like, based on sort of one, everyone's quoting the same sort of original study that was done in one really small patient population in one particular geography, and they're extrapolating that to the entire United States or the entire world.
Right.
How solid is that actual number, right? And oftentimes it's not that solid. So you got to think really thoughtfully about that. So anyways, there's a lot of things that we thought about. Again, I'm not sure, Derek, if I'm exactly answering your question, but as we put things together, as I said, the management team, the technology, and the capital, all these things had to come together. And we're sort of thinking through, the levels of de-risking when it came to all these different areas. The last thing that I'll say, and then I'm going to pause, and as a really foundational part of the model was the incubation. We call it de-risking, where we take on a program that could come from a variety of sources. And the model actually, as we're sourcing these technologies, you have to be kind of scrappy, right? I think in the early days, maybe there were fewer companies that were going after these individual assets, but more and more you see a number of companies that are asset aggregators that are looking for these interesting assets. Venture firms that are looking to build companies around particular areas, biotechs that are looking to expand their pipelines. There were just a number of groups that came up where it required, being able to sell the model and being scrappy enough to find these assets and and good enough timing before others, or maybe even uncovering value that maybe others miss, where maybe there's a little bit of, maybe there's some gaps in the story, maybe there's a little bit of, uncertainty, but being able to uncover that. And then this is where the incubation, the de-risking came in, where we would, part of the model is that we would actually incubate programs, for anywhere from 6 months up to a couple of years, where we actually had capital in-house provided by our investors for the specific purpose of being able to incubate these programs, being able to de-risk these programs, where there was questions on, well, what is the biodistribution? If it's a CNS, indication, does it get across the blood-brain barrier? Is it active in the most relevant preclinical model? Understanding, and sometimes it was commercial diligence. Actually, there's a novel indication, like doing that commercial diligence. So for a number of these areas where we had capital and time as a part of the model, innate to the model, to be able to de-risk these programs, incubate them. And then for those that actually met our sort of predefined criteria, we take those into company formation, form companies around these programs. And again, there's a lot of attrition, which is proof that the model is working. Like, in the sense that, you want to kill things quickly. And part of the de-risking is to be able to say, well, what are the programs that actually have legs to go further, to advance into the clinic, that made sense for the model, and the programs that didn't, right? And so being able to discern that. So again, Derek, I'm not sure if I'm directly answering your question, but there's so much that goes into that question about, how the model works, and what, made it successful. What are the challenges that, but hopefully that was helpful.
I want to pull out two pieces of what you just talked about. In the 4 minute, the 4 minutes of like, this is the Sidon model. So one is regulatory. How important is it that you have a federal regulatory, I will talk about federal at this point rather than state by state, right? A federal regulatory path that could offer an accelerated process, right, for rare disease. And then the second piece is related, but how important is it that you work with patients early on in the process in the development of therapeutics?
Yeah, I love those questions. And I think, so to start with the regulatory, and it really, the short answer to both is like very important. It's not the short answer, but let me expand on that. I think on the regulatory side, that was absolutely crucial for us. And I think that, and to be honest, we had some ups and downs on that, right? In terms of, again, if you're trying to pave the way for an indication where no drug has ever been developed, there's a lot of unknowns, right? And even, obviously, there was an example where, what constitutes a rare disease in terms of getting orphan drug designation, right? If we're going after a novel indication, there was an example for us where, we felt, and all the experts, weighed in as well, like, oh, this is definitely an orphan disease, right? But being able to get that orphan drug exclusivity, which would enable us to have the exclusivity that we need to build the business case, be able to protect our drug was crucial. And there were times where we were at odds with the regulators, right? So that turns out to be really, really crucial, right? Everything, that's just one example. Obviously, kind of the one that's more salient in many ways is sort of what are the endpoints and what are the regulators going to require? Because if you're going after a new indication in a rare disease space, that's not always determined. And you've got to, and you're kind of, you're building the plane as you fly it, so to speak, in terms of, what are the measures, what are the parameters that you're going to look at? And this relates to the second question in terms of the patient community. I think for us, it was really important to be a part of the patient community and to really, especially in areas where we're going deep, where we're actually working on projects, to engage them early on. And I think, it's a two-way relationship. I think, we really strove to help them out. And I think even from the standpoint of even just like, little, charity events and being able to support them in those initiatives and giving some grants, et cetera, all the way to, as we're developing our drug, what matters to them, right? You could think that, okay, well, for this particular indication, this is what everyone talks about, 6-minute walk, right? Or whatever it is.
Right.
But, there was an indication we were targeting, and it was an orphan cardiology indication where, we just gained perspective. We worked with a group called Trend, and that really kind of helped us, interview and interact with the patient community and understand what is their experience, what actually matters to them. And it turns out that a lot of times what people tend to focus on, maybe even in the literature, or when you talk to, one of the KOLs, wasn't necessarily always what the patients were focused on.
Right.
And some of the quality of life measures for them that maybe were a little bit harder to quantify, they were really important for the patients, right? Or being able to sort of decrease their meds that they were currently on, that, meds that were being used off label, but that made them feel awful,
Yeah.
turned out to be really important for them. So if you actually had a drug that could actually help them decrease, their medication that was making them feel like a zombie, they actually use that word, sort of a zombie, right? Beta blocker zombies, right? Because it just made them feel terrible. That was actually important. So again, engaging them at that level, understanding what's really important, and thinking about that when it came to clinical development, and even thinking about the patients that you would actually select for a particular trial became really important. And so we found it really, essential to our strategy to be able to do that. And again, I think that, so it was, and again, it was a two-way street just from the standpoint, they were really helpful for us, getting that perspective. And then also thinking about, okay, well, natural history studies, that's kind of a word that you'll hear oftentimes for those who are in the rare disease space, that's important, because you got to understand, well, what is the progression and what are the implications in terms of the timeline for the clinical study? What's the implication for the patient population that you would target, the inclusion exclusion criteria, to really try to be able to, maximize the chances of success for your particular drug. So, and even from the regulatory going back, I mean, I think the regulators actually had been, over the last number of years, we're setting up forums where they would actually engage the patient community, which again, I applaud the FDA for doing that, to be able to engage the patient community on the exact questions that I just mentioned, in terms of understanding, okay, well, what really matters to the patients. We see things even from social media. I think one of the things that's been interesting is in our landscape, a lot of these patient communities are able to, grab attention and get attention for their disease, which they would not have otherwise prior to sort of the, the sort of social media era that we're in. Finding other families that have the same indication using social media has been crucial. So again, building out, you can talk about patient registries and building out that sort of, the patient databases, which helps companies in the rare disease space. So again, a lot more that I could say, but again, I know we're running short on time here as well. So.
Where do you see, so we have like 2.5 minutes left. Give us your crystal ball as far as how you see the progression of rare disease, like company incubation over the next, let's say 5 to 10 years. We'll give you a little bit longer window.
Wow. Yeah. So, I mean, I wish I could give you a really sort of defined answer on that. I mean, I think it's in some ways hard to comment on that time frame, but maybe a trend that I think it's a really exciting time to be in biotech and to be in healthcare, just because I think that, just thinking about, sort of early on, maybe rewind before I was even in the industry, right? So going back to, decades ago, where the primary modalities were small molecules and then antibodies. You had Genentech kind of in the
right.
sort of,
antibodies were new, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Biologics.
Exactly. Yes, and we're in an exciting time because I think there's these novel modalities I think are really going to make an impact. And again, the human genome was sequenced right around the turn of the millennium, right? And I think that once it's sequenced, that was only the first point, right? It's been decades now where we're really trying to understand, well, what does all this information mean? But I think we're at an exciting time in terms of where we are in our understanding of the biology, right? And so one, with respect to modality, so now you have not just small molecules and antibodies, but you've got antisense technology, you've got gene therapy, you've got gene editing, you've got RNA therapies, you've got all these different new novel modalities that are coming out, right? And that really can make an impact. And so I think it's an exciting time. I think looking out 5-10 years where there are going to be winners and losers. And again, even thinking about gene therapy, there's been some correction in that. There's been some winners and losers, right?
Yep.
But I think there is going to be a time in terms of understanding these novel modalities. There are going to be winners and losers, but I do think that they're going to be winners. And that's going to be really promising as we understand the biology more. What do we need to do to make gene therapy work? What do we need to do for gene editing to really actually work and become an approved therapy? What do we need to do in terms of targeting RNA with small molecules or targeting using RNA? So I think as our understanding matures, it's an exciting time that allows us to go into areas that we've never been able to go after indications where the biology maybe is not conducive to target with small molecules or antibodies. So I think it's just an exciting time, and I think these technologies are going to mature, and they're going to be winners and losers, but we're going to have a more mature understanding of what's going to make the winners. Thinking about also just in terms of making sense of the genetics, making sense of the biology as we have more and more data. Again, I don't know about AI/ML. People talk about that a lot, where that's going to go. But I think eventually there is going to be some understanding that it's going to help, and it's going to help contribute to understanding. But understanding the biology, like I give the example, dissecting the complement cascade, understand which components are relevant for particular indications. Immunology, understanding, there's a lot of things in which precision immunology, precision CNS, understanding sort of what are the relevant targets, and as understanding the biology matures, to be able to hit the right target and do that effectively. So that's something I'm really excited about for the rare disease space. We need to work on the business model, as especially for these ultra rare indications. That's a big question mark. How do we develop a drug successfully where the business case can make sense? So anyways, sorry that was a mouthful, but yeah.
That's okay. That's okay. When we give people a crystal ball at the end, we give you a little leeway. So listen, I want to really thank you for coming on today. You were fantastic, and I think so much of this highlights, especially for rare disease patients, that N of 1 matters. Every patient matters, and I think with every little advance we have, we keep putting these little puzzle pieces into things where we're going to help out patients in the future. Right. I think that's super, super important. Thank you so much for being with us today. Everybody else, thank you so much for hanging with us a little past 10 o'clock. Everybody have a great day.
Thank you for the invitation. All right. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to New York Bio's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on New York Bio, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.